doing here in our school in the future, because there will be plenty of opportunity to talk and hear more about this. Brett and I, we've met, if I got the year right, in year 2006 in London, where you invited me for a lecture, and I remember very well this nice dinner reception we had. I think it was the library, sitting together. And now 12 years later, standing here, it's kind of an amazing surprise. I think none of us would have seen that coming, right? He was born in the United States, grew up in Oregon, Idaho, before he moved to the United Kingdom, where he became a citizen, a British citizen, about 2 years ago, right before the Brexit, right? So
just in time to leave.
Just in time to leave, right? Good time. He studied architecture at the University of Oregon and the Art Institute in San Francisco. He spent time working in New York before he went to the UK to graduate at the AA. Not all of us are architects here in the room. AA is standing for Architectural Association School of Architecture in London, and it's the oldest independent architecture school in the country, and probably one of the 3-4 best architecture schools in the world. While a student at the AA, he was working with Zaha Hadid, amazing architect who passed away last year at a very early age, and seemed to sit right. And then later he joined the studio, the Zaha Hadid studio, as a project architect. In the mid-90s, he joined the AA again, now as a staff member. In 2005, he became the academic leader, the director of the AA, and he was doing so until 2017, when he finally came here to California to be the head of our school. Brett Steele. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Christian, and Brenda for the kind invite to come downstairs. Christian and I were chatting on the phone last week, and he thought maybe what might be of use is to speak a little bit about myself and my background in the talk today. I can't imagine a more boring thing to do for 40 or 45 minutes than to talk about oneself, so I'm going to try really hard to not do that, and the way I've tried to frame that is really around sharing with you some of the questions that have come up repeatedly in conversations I've had with my students and faculty to this point in my life within higher education. This was the room I left almost exactly a year ago when I snuck over here between two classes to begin a process that led to me arriving here. I had just finished choreographing our annual launch event at the school in London in a funny little place called Bedford Square, which is today the last intact Georgian square in London, i.e. the last self-contained public space built by a group of people called the Georgians 250 years ago, which, when it was first built by a fellow named the Duke of Bedford, was railed against as the destruction of England. It was a commercial real estate development that the Prince of Wales, amongst many others, used as a prototype for a rant against modern architecture, which continues really to this day in that funny little square. The students at that school in London had been doing exactly what my students were doing this time last year for a very long time, which is effectively trying to travel in time from a moment where they might be as students to where they either were in their past, in the form of previous generations doing that work within a school, or where they might be 50 years from now. That was the brief I gave my first year class in that previous picture, to try and imagine themselves in the year 20, 30, 40, or sooner, when they would begin doing the work that they would self-identify with as designers and architects. This is a group of 1950 students, bizarrely dressed as if 1920 students in that same room, and again, parodying or experimenting with what it meant to be a student in the most literal, everyday, ordinary sense in a school today. This is the peculiar fellow who built that square and a series of little houses that the Architectural Association has grown up around. Roughly speaking, it's a school of 1,200 students and staff that serve as the school community, it's called, in that school, who, amongst other things, elect people like me to lead that community. In British parliamentarian fashion, my role as a school director is literally an elected role, and renewals of that responsibility are also subject to referendums across the entire school. That all takes place in these kinds of rooms. Originally, a series of rooms built for about 7 families that today are occupied by more than 1,000 people. No room even half the size, I would say, of this auditorium over the 160 years of the school. One of the advantages of that paradigm, you could say, is that it looks always crowded and inhabited. I think one of the great dangers of most modern schools is they simply make rooms that are too big. I think the life of a school is lived, as you all know, and the interactions we all have in all kinds of funny spaces that for me became a model for really what it means to try and think about the life of a school as a place in which the movement of bodies and ideas becomes the medium through which we discover, communicate, disseminate, broadcast ideas. So looking at this front entrance hall photograph on a typical evening in London is not unlike the experience of how many of those bodies arrived in that room. In this case, through what was at the time I took this photograph, the most densely inhabited building or space in human history. Some of you have been there. This would be Terminal 4 at Heathrow Airport, which annually moved, at the time I took the photograph, something like 70 million people around the world through that space as part of larger journeys into or out of a city like London, which is about 20 miles away from that room. And for me, that almost became a kind of model for how to think about what a school is. An infrastructure for not just the production and interrogation of ideas, but also for literally their ability to move those ideas around the world as we know it. And in a sense, what we began to explore about 15 years ago is the idea of a school taking on a different kind of form than the one it evolved out of in the 19th century, which you could say was far more geographic and singular in its organization than the kinds of entities we can think of today. So for me, the model of a school becomes almost like this kind of a space, a thing that can travel and move around the world, connect with different audiences, projects, initiatives, disciplines, forms of interest, and bring that experience back to one of those dots. Looks like it's number 12 in this picture, which happened to be Bedford Square, where the majority of students and staff might be at any one time. But by the time I stepped away from it last year, was a school operating in roughly 65 cities and countries around the world, and continuously bringing projects and ideas back and forth across that continuum of space that really lets us think about what a school might be today. One of the experiences that sort of a model was trying to build on is, of course, this well-known episode in the peculiar late modern life of architecture, which was a group of 2 graduate students and a couple of very bright young architects in New Haven who said that in order to think and discover where architecture might be going, the one thing they had to do was to leave that studio behind. And of course, famously did so on a trip to Las Vegas. And in a little biographical note, was in fact a way station on the way to this school in Los Angeles, where Denise Scott Brown was at the time teaching and lecturing, and for a short period became a confrontation between where architecture or design thinking might have been in the 1960s when thought about back in graduate studios and academies, and the kinds of new places emerging across, in this case, America, but increasingly across the globe, that could challenge the assumptions and the settled habits of what modern architecture might be. This is a terrified Bob Venturi standing in front of what they discovered in Las Vegas, and a visit to the first city ever built in the world based upon television shows and films, which was, of course, the driving force for the arrival of an entirely new kind of city in the world, which Las Vegas briefly became emblematic of. So the the challenge around all of that for me is really to think of the ways in which schools operate as a kind of platform for students and not just faculty to really do one thing, to discover, mutate, broadcast, communicate one's own identity within a discipline or a field or multiple fields and genres at any one time. I think that is exactly what schools were invented, roughly speaking, 170 years ago to try and do. Schools are incredibly archaic, I would argue, in the early 21st century for their over-reliance on certain 19th century habits that most of you with smartphones and multiple screens demonstrate on an hourly basis that should become the forms of knowledge and experience that can in turn transform schools in new and unexpected ways. And I think one of the great challenges for schools of all kinds is to think about the ways in which, as the masks and identities of students change in time, that you all are constructing as you enter into your fields, so too the schools and platforms that support that activity must also adapt and change. This for me is one of the heroic figures in the small, narrow field of architectural education in the 20th century, demonstrated the validity of that sort of a thesis. She was one of the many protesters who occupied a very settled and calm environment like the Bauhaus in the early 1920s in Dessau to try and, in fact, surpass some of the pedagogical assumptions of her dean and school director, who only lasted about 6 years before being thrown out by the students of the Bauhaus, ironically because of Walter Gropius's belief that you shouldn't teach history in a school, something the students objected to dramatically, and in fact began a process in which what we think of as an art or an architectural school is in fact a place where the identity of those who inhabit it merges or fuses fundamentally with the work we do in that setting. And it's that kind of equilibrium or disequilibrium between our own sense of self and that thing we call a portfolio or a project, in which over the years becomes a career and a trajectory. It's in that interplay that schools can be measured by their capacity to contribute to these larger creative or other cultural forms of production. That figure who occupies those things we think of as studios or offices or performance halls or stages, that figure we all would acknowledge is a kind of construction. In fact, most of the times it's a construction like this late 19th century etching. It's a kind of mythic origin that is written as a part of the history of that discipline. This is an etching from Viollet-le-Duc in about 1860 in London, where the supposed birth of English architecture is given form and appearance as part of a story in which that figure is fundamentally fused into and a part of this almost monastic-like withdrawal from the world. And indeed, that's one of the things that back in London over the last several years we've been exploring, which is the ways in which we can continue to see schools and studios and our own activities rewire themselves to a much larger and much noisier kind of environment. So I think, particularly from the narrow view of architecture, too often architects tend to think of the idea of technology as a kind of component to the world, right? That technologies are designed artificial objects, and in fact, in most architects' minds, even modern architects' minds, ironically, technologies were things to kind of contain and place and give form to. Maybe most famously in the theories of in the 1950s and 60s of a figure like Lou Kahn, who developed some elaborate, because of his fear of ductwork and technology, a sort of elaborate theory for how all that stuff should go in one place so that we could all be in the public space uninterrupted by that stuff. By the 1960s on 6th Avenue, the massive increase of vertical movement systems, air, water, telephony, electronics, all of that was becoming the point at which you can see it's nearly dominating the interior landscape of something like a tall building. It became such a kind of caricature to contain and control that by the 70s, when this plan is first drawn by an AA graduate named Richard Rogers for his design of the Lloyd Center in the City of London, that technology is literally flipped outward and becomes the decoration, the architectural detailing of the superstructure. And of course, in our living lifetime, what might have started as a very simple, small feature of most space within a school or modern environment, a relatively small amount of equipment and technology, has of course continued to simply expand and amplify itself to the point that in any given day, if you were to look at a building like the one we're standing in, what you and I would think of as the space is this little small corner where all of the machines and ductwork and servicing have been held back. That's simply now a part of the new nature of what it means to try and make the space of a school or any other kind of civic or common space. And rather than seeing technology as a kind of added feature to a 2,000-year-old discipline that somehow was interrupting and bothersome and that could be self-contained, to try and flip that slightly, the important point would be to remember, and I would certainly think DMA knows this as well as anyone in the universe, everything is technological. Everything is the product of a design, not always with a clear intent or purpose, but it's a design that's been brought for some purpose into the world. And that's, of course, exactly what a school was. And what became interesting as we have all lived through the proliferation of new kinds of media and technologies is, of course, they bring over and over again the basis for reconfiguring what we think of as the space of teaching and learning within a school, to the point that even the physical setting of a school is something fundamentally undermined on an almost daily basis as we all move in and out of a building like this one. These were diagrams I did in about 2004 of a first prototype for this project in the creation of something called the Design Research Lab back in London, in which the network connectivity of the technologies our design teams were working with, in fact, became the basis for redesigning the idea of what a curriculum would be. So, for example, the idea that these technologies, by promoting collaborative, team-based group projects, became the basis for us to design a curriculum, in fact, where students never worked individually at all during the period of a year and a half or 2 years they were with us. Our teachers never taught individually in a course. I would always have a partner with me, often one who had a very different view of where the universe might be or where architecture ought to be. But of course, it was in the interaction between those kind of actors that the basis for a different kind of learning could begin to emerge, and that in fact could be seen as a kind of pedagogical impulse, not unlike the sort of project-based, project-driven, collaborative interfaces that architects especially started to see themselves working with in the mid to late 1990s. We launched that program, the Design Research Lab, the year in which the last operating system in the world was released, built around a single self-contained workstation. Something most of the students are way too young to remember, but there was once an operating system that had no expectation that it would talk to a next computer. Microsoft branded that moment Windows to NT. That entire world in 1995 to 96, which is when that happens, is the moment in which these kind of interfaces also become the space through which projects are now increasingly passing. And as a teacher, what interested me was that suddenly, of course, these machinic learning environments were becoming the basis almost immediately for forms of teaching that I could hardly recognize, let alone begin to control. So I asked one of my teams, this is in about 1999, to simply capture over the course of a 24-hour period all of the error messages that were coming up on their screen as they started working with modeling environments, rendering systems, whatever it might have been at the time. And it becomes one of the contexts around which then our idea was for a studio in which all of the work would be immediately not just produced, but archived in the kind of elastic archives that these systems began to promote, and simply made available to every student within the program, and then within a very short period to anyone beyond that studio or program that might be connected to it. It's a fantastic year 2000 image to give you an idea of how recent this happened back in London, which is slow to modernize. This was the year in which we figured out we could steal the internet from a company called Imagination next door. The AA literally had no backbone to the school. We downloaded instructions for taking a cardboard tube and wrapping a copper wire around it. It became an antenna to the company that was at the time managing the national lottery system, had very good bandwidth. And this team was able, of course, to then connect itself to that network of collaborators they were working with even by then, that in this case was printing panels back in Ljubljana at a fraction of the cost of particularly London, and that simply expanded that space of the teaching and learning on its own terms. That was a very interesting moment, let's say, again, within the little world of architecture when, and this was the year I began teaching, the end of this long chart, in the year 1995, which was the end of let's say a century in which the dominant technology for communication was stuff called books. And at exactly the moment, and in one of those kind of wonderful chance things that ends up affecting one's life, in November 1995, I snapped this photograph of the last of those big books being launched into the world. It was a very big event in the little world of architecture. Rem Koolhaas came in and summarized 20 years of work in a book called SML-XL that CNN and others covered at the moment, which became very quickly the largest selling book in the history of the discipline, but also which, interestingly, and this is, I think, probably the best evidence that the book as we know it was starting to become a different kind of form. Rem didn't present what's in the book, he just presented the book. Sort of caressed it for an hour, talked about it. My students began very quickly rethinking what the role of books might be in a discipline like architecture that's long used them. You can't make it out here, but there's the book being used as a prop for a computer screen to get it up to the height where it was more usable. I began seeing admissions to the AA very quickly like this kind of a performance being played out on that centuries-old medium of monographs. One peculiar Dutch student sent me a video of burning the book, which we suggested he had issues that probably suggested the program wasn't the right place for him. I, many years later, did an exhibition on the history of the role the book has played within that particular practice. It's an office called OMA, which ironically begins in 1972 with the publishing of a book. This was the first sketch made by the office 6 years before the launch of that book of what it would be. And of course, the great thing, I found this in the archive of OMA, and the great thing is, of course, what they're plugging into is the shift that's taking place in our thinking of a medium more as a broader form of information. This is a book that, by the way, took longer to realize than the headquarters of CCTV in Beijing 15 years later. Architects have issues with books. The interesting thing is, of course, that incredibly imposing building material of the printed book in the 20th century is, by the end of the 20th century, rapidly evolving into a different kind of medium of communication. November 1995 is the month that Tim Berners-Lee releases the updated protocol for what would then roll out as the World Wide Web. November 1995 is the month when Gilles Deleuze, let's say the first great philosopher of network life, throws himself from his balcony in Paris and kills himself. And you can write that story as a kind of conspiracy theory of what books and network life are doing in any number of ways. But what's clearly happening at that moment is the idea of communication within what we think of as the arts or architecture or other creative fields is undergoing a profound and at times quite abrupt and even tragic transformation. And in ways that are not unlike what happens in the 19th century, where our idea of a modern art and architectural school is also given life by the initial industrialization of all kinds of forces. What we've been living through isn't a new thing. It's not a difference in kind, it's a difference in degree of the sort of transformation, sometimes abrupt and unplanned, within medias, technologies, everyday life that are in fact the forces that give birth to what you and I would call the art and architecture school, even in its form over 100 years ago. The point I've always tried to emphasize around that history, and I don't have time to work through that history in any great detail here, but the important point is that idea of a school, and particularly if one thinks of it as a technology, changes and evolves like all other technologies. Nothing is fixed. So this is a school of roughly 500 students in 1876. Maybe 25 years after it initially founds in two forms in Paris. It's one of the first great art and architecture schools. By the early 20th century, populations, again, of about 400 to 500 students are in spaces like that. You can see where this is going to go in a minute. I think after the war and the rampant professionalization of architecture schools, you then have outposts, particularly at Ivy League schools on the east coast of America. Again, roughly 500 students in big monolithic entities. On the right is the school of 500 students when I drew this picture in 2005. And the school I set up alongside that, called the DRL, was a fraction of that. And what we're really seeing happen is, of course, our idea of the space of a school is literally changing in the life of that technology. It isn't that different than other technologies. And part of the reason I think that sort of a history is worth looking at is to give us the confidence to say, well, what is it about the habits and spaces and routines of a school that we take for granted, carry forward, and what are those in which we think about the use of space around teaching and learning in different and unexpected ways? I took this photograph that same year in 2005 as I started to realize all of this junk on our working tables was actually becoming the foreground for any photograph of where we thought creative ideas were going to live. It was a kind of Trojan horse, I realized, brought in by screens, not to make the computer a different kind of appliance within the studio, so much as to deliver a different sense. And that's what all that wiring is, a kind of Trojan horse for bringing into what we call the space of the studio, connectivity itself, as a kind of fundamental medium around which forms of art and cultural production of all kinds might be seen to live. The point I always make to very insecure and uncertain architects around that reality, which once used to be seen as a sort of alienating force back in the day, is, of course, that's exactly the kind of experience other creative fields had long gone through. Let's say music is probably the most extreme form, where the electronification of the studio, the amplification of the instruments, leads initially to artists trying to make stuff that sounds like what things sounded like before, but very quickly evolves into entirely new kinds of music forms. The really extreme case, and as the grandfather of this kind of a person, who is a person you listen to now on Spotify lists or wherever those worlds live, who lives in his parents' bedroom out behind the house and simply runs sound through his network of instruments, is simply the latest iteration of something that Brian Eno, amongst others, stumbles upon in the 1970s, which is once we start to wire together space for creative thinking, what you have the basis for is, of course, an entirely different kind of sound in the world. Eno, famously, in the year he's injured in London, lying in a hospital bed, develops this idea of what we all call today ambient music. A music that isn't composed, isn't narrative, isn't serial, which was the previous avant-garde modern sort of paradigm, but a kind of flowing of sound between various sources that it's so important to him as a composer that, in fact, when he issues his famous of all his great, thank you, when he releases his sort of seminal piece, what he puts on the cover is simply a wiring diagram to try and possibly explain where all of that sound came from. This is the album Discrete Music in 1975 that when he's commissioned by the record company to produce it, Brian spends several months wiring together a series of instruments, sampled sound, relay devices, sets it up in a studio, hits play, goes in the other room, makes tea and stays away for a day, comes back, and he's produced 8 hours of music. He sends the 8 hours to the studio. The studio goes crazy. Like, this is not music. But of course, what he's experimenting with is the interface between how we produce what we produce creatively and the form it can or should take as a part of that experience. And that's, of course, the thing that so many fields today and your lives as a generation of young artists and performers and thinkers will forward in ways that none of us could possibly imagine now. I'm going to skip some of my friends for a minute. It sounds occasionally like I'm wildly optimistic about this universe, and it's interesting, and it is. Like gravity is interesting. It's just here. It's a part of our world. It's a thing to take hold of. On the flip side, this is a partner we worked with in London for years that sits on the top. This is the 53rd floor of a wonderful building in Tokyo, in which every designer, this is 2005, I took this picture. Every designer has arrived to work, and a server down in the lobby of this building is reading an RFID tag as they arrive to work that day. They can sit at any workstation up on this floor that they want to. Because they're wearing an RFID tag as they sit down, each workstation knows exactly who they are, what their skill set is, what they worked on yesterday, and simply loads up a job for them to work on, each one of these lovely designers. The fellow that develops this system had, as a business plan, the ability to drop from 3 months to 3 weeks the production time it would take between developing a new operating system or interface for a mobile phone and it being in our hands. What was driving it ultimately was a 3-day period in which that could be closed. And of course, the difficulty with this entire system is that these are, again, artificial designed. They have no pre-given form. They are things for us to interrogate, challenge, and develop ideas in relation to. I find it the most terrifying kind of work environment imaginable until one realizes, of course, it's an echo of the forms of machining life that have driven modern production and thinking literally throughout the last 100-year period. This is one of those fantastic Frank Lloyd Wright interiors that people never talk about in the history of that discipline. I think the merging, obviously, of ourselves as organic entities with various non-organic technologies is, of course, again, one of the defining features of not just our own creative fields, but also, in interesting ways, a history of that thing we think of as the modern city, which 100 years ago on one street in New York launches with Thomas Edison's wiring of Canal Street. For the first time ever, the idea of a street that could live 24 hours a day, and that by the end of the 20th century is, of course, a networking and cabling exercise that leads literally to every workstation connected back to that larger city. And what we get to experiment with, and which I know all of you are already, is what that relationship is or isn't or will be or can be between that thing we call a studio or a performance space and that larger space of the city. The collapse between those two things is one of the really striking features of creative fields of all kinds today. Not just the collapse between the space we work in and the people that do the work within it, but that space to the larger city around it. This is one of my students who, best I could tell, was wired into a studio for 18 months before we found a way to drag him out at the end of it to show the work he was doing. Again, nothing new to this, other than maybe to make the point that what we're witnessing, of course, is the evolution of that thing we used to call nature into a completely different kind of space. A space that we are actively, in an Anthropocene era, ourselves part of the designers for. And it's not that old nature looks different, which it does, but that it includes these things we formerly treated as artificial additions, like technologies, which has all these kind of, wonderful effects. Every time I go to Japan, the opportunity to eat square watermelons is just something you can't pass up. I mean, the idea that we can tame to our own purposes those things we think of as naturally occurring, just to me astonishing. And to move to LA for me is to, of course, see architecture having been disciplined in the same sort of way into entities now, spaces, that we live in only ever in other machines, right? Like the car on a freeway. I mean, it's a kind of building type that none of us could have really ever imagined, in which architects too often still think like that's the architecture. You know, these little boxes sort of on the side, which are just, you know, it's not that they're not architecture, they're simply part of a much broader spectrum for what that kind of a form of knowledge might constitute today. Or at an even more extreme example than the horizontality of Los Angeles, let's say a city like this one, where we've run a school for the last decade, in which the occupants of Dubai have an average age that is older than the city itself. Like a complete reversal of whatever assumption we might have ever had about the relationship between the subject and its space. Right? I think the point about all of our attention, let's say, being given over today to that kind of a working regime is that it is still a kind of idealization, just as it's been for a very long time. It's just that that idea of the body is no longer a geometric inscription in space, so much as it is, instead of geometry, a kind of choreography of how we will relate to these systems that are wrapping around all of us as we work on the future of our fields. I'm going to skip this. The point I want to make, sorry, this was a photograph taken at my last presentation as a student, just for the students in the room, like we were all you once. So this is exactly 30 years ago, my last presentation as a student at the AA with a group of people who gave me a very hard time, as critics, good critics do, some of whom actually became good friends over the years, some not. And inset in it is actually exactly 10 years later when I went back to the school to begin work as a teacher in the DRL, a photograph of the first jury I choreographed as a director of that program. The point of the story is that we will all have a biographical version of this as creative minds, most of which we could honestly spend with our therapist the rest of the day talking about. I'm not going to. But the point is, it's exactly that confrontation between your work and an audience of some kind where the life of a discipline is lived. That is the core technology of a school. That space, which comes in many different forms, and I mentioned it to the students only to remind you that that's something to embrace. That is where and how you will be formed. And your ability to see the shaping of audiences alongside the ideas and ambitions of your work is, of course, the nuance that will define where and how some fields move in the direction they do. That has simply always been the case in our fields where knowledge is formed through its doing and then presenting or conveying to those around us. So, sorry, let me just see if I can go back one so you can see one of, so this fellow, these are all peculiar. This was my fifth-year tutor, Peter Cook, who forms in the 1960s a group called Archigram, who basically just want to make cities start walking around. The other extreme, Cedric Price, is, I just wanted to show Cedric here as an example. This is Cedric 30 years before I encountered him doing the same thing. Musing over, and the thing that's great about this photograph, if you look at him, is he's the only guy looking away from Walter Gropius. He is already, in 1956, 1958, on a track that will take him to a very different kind of project, and in fact take architecture in a very different way. And, lovely kind of DMA project for you all to remember, this one of Cedric's foundational ideas that we should think of a building, this is his floor plan for what he called the Fun Palace, we should think of a building more as a circuitry than as a fixed, fossilized kind of physical entity. My point is that Cedric idea is formed fantastically in confrontation with the kinds of old-fashioned modernism that Gropius, by the 1950s, was bringing to London and shopping around to an audience already on the move elsewhere. The faculty in a school, and these were some of mine, 4 of 260 faculty members in London, that's what faculty do. They take ideas out, they, if they're good at their job, integrate or critique or amend thinking based on things that are learned in those settings. It is, by the way, as a faculty member, exactly what creative people are always doing. In this case, a very suspicious Philip Johnson with a very eager Andy Warhol sitting down together to chat in Philip's house about what was wrong with modernism and why pop art might actually exist as an idea. One of the really compelling things for me in the history of that kind of a project is the way in which the creative mind goes from being a singular one to an either productive schizophrenic, let's say in the case of a Johnson, or a genuine multiplicity. In the arrival, particularly in the 1960s, of increasingly distributed forms of thinking and innovating within fields. Sometimes they're intensely corporate. Like up here in the top picture is a Gordon Bunshoft gathered around the 14 elements of design that SOM worked through at the time. And at the other extreme, a group of radical hippies like Super Studio or Archizoom, who were also, by definition, assuming a project would be forwarded through the interaction of one creative mind with many others. That's the question, really, for schools, right? How can we, as a school, foreground that question above all else for you? I don't think it's the job of a school to be the infrastructure to ask that question, because ultimately you're going to have to ask it of yourself. But I think the job of schools is, to a very large degree, to create the circumstances whereby the different ways in which that question has been asked in the past can become a kind of model for going forward. And I think I'll probably just stop there. I think that's enough time. Thanks, everybody. Absolutely. Absolutely. Questions? Hiya. Oh, thank you. Huh. Yeah. I don't know yet. I think the thing I find interesting about exact opposites is that they're the same thing in some way. They're two sides of a coin. I think, yes, I've walked into a world in which, let's say, institutional stability is striking. That's just in part the nature of a campus or a university in the early 21st century compared to the worlds I come from. I've never been in a university before, I got to admit up front. Like, it's a novelty a month into it. That's one thing. The second is, but this is a broader issue than I think UCLA, everybody's just got so much space. Like, it's kind of weird. Like, I don't know yet, actually. I mean, what I want to learn about is what does that kind of amplified physical space actually afford you to do that other settings might not? It's not a question of what the qualities are so much as where and how we can marry qualities to potential to try and do things. And I'm afraid it's just kind of too early in the day for me on that front. I'm just really struck by it. You guys have so much space. I mean, yeah, no, I agreed. Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. Believe me, I feel it already. I know, I get that. I mean, I'm in the worst place. You all know. I mean, they put the dean like halfway to the clouds. And you then make me stare north away from everything. It's like, it's like a recipe for something. I don't know what. But I don't know yet. I think particularly in the world of DMA, of course, the question of connectivity is tangible. I think, in fact, it's become such a kind of everyday cliche of early 21st century life that you will start to see emerge more and more the revisiting of what silos really are in the world, intellectual silos. I mean, Soho in the 1960s in New York was an island to itself. It was a bunch of empty rabble-aroused streets that you could barely walk through. You could, in fact, you wouldn't if you didn't have to, because you'd probably not survive. And the history of the modern university, for those of you that don't know it, is that it emerges in Europe out of what used to be called the monastery. And And in fact, from roughly St. Gall and forward into the 15 and 1600s, the really interesting thing about that monastic life is that there was an expectation that to produce new technologies, forms of knowledge, which is weirdly in the brief of monasteries, there was a need to actually withdraw to a certain degree. That's, the orders were about that. And I think one of the really interesting tensions in the 21st century will be between this idea of presumed connectivity and the ability for a sort of strategic withdrawal to, with a few colleagues or random projects or whatever it might be, to actually advance projects that can then be taken out in the world. So before I leap into the idea that, well, the world's just badly connected, we can better connect our world, I think it's really worth asking the questions around how and why we want to do that more than anything. I mean, I feel it, and believe me, I'm the most isolated of all of you right now. I'm waiting for you to invite me to a presentation or a jury, something to just see what you're working on. But I think it'll be a thing for us to think about as a school. I mean, connectivity in this city is very different than the forms I've ever seen in a city before. I mean, I've never been in a city in which space is measured by the time on a road and not like physical distance. Like, I've never seen that. I mean, but it's super interesting. Huh? Well, yeah, okay. I'm naive, yeah. Sorry. What are the questions, you guys? What are there?
You dedicated at least the last 2 decades to education, I guess, somehow.
Uh-huh.
Are you missing your design practice, the making
Huh.
of things?
No, that's a great question. No, I'm not, because I'm totally not. First of all, I don't think I was a very good designer of buildings. I mean, I also worked with scary, strange kinds of designers, like, people whose ideas were, for me, as I was working on them, really hard to comprehend. Like, Zaha's work was hard that way, because she had no interest in building, and yet she wanted to change the world. And, I'm sorry, those two things didn't square. And she ended up doing a bit of both. But I don't see the leading of a school as anything but a design project. First of all, that's the only education I have. I mean, it's not like you go learn to be a dean somewhere. And first of all, no one would trust anybody who did that for all the right reasons, right? I mean, it's part of what I'm trying to show, and this is just a short kind of arc on the history of that thing we call an experimental art and architecture school, is that it's always been an open exercise. And I think we got to embrace that belief. And it's hard in places where it looks like everything is sort of settled and frankly costs so much money, it's hard to believe. But I think you have to embrace it with the confidence that those worlds can and need to be rethought collectively by a body we think of as that school. For me, it's totally a design project. And probably most interesting for not being object-based as much as the combination of object, interface, and event space, the three things sort of together, which is the constituent features of a school. What else?
Really, thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
I'm really intrigued by this kind of conversation about the status of the site work.
Mm-hmm.
Organic art gets attached.
Yeah.
So the city, in fact, is an extension of the human body, reflected and so forth. And so this has a discussion about how the human body via the school produces this kind of infrastructure. And I'm also kind of curious about the output. From a distance at the AAA, you can see that the publication series, the events, the lectures, and so forth. These are very visible outputs.
Yeah.
In a way, like the what versus the how. I'm kind of curious, what things that we might look for.
No, absolutely. And in part, and sorry, I've cut it off maybe. I'm sensitive to time. I mean, I'm like between you and lunch. It's like the worst thing. And I had actually a section on the topic of audiences. And I think, to a very large degree, I think schools, to a fault, bias the artist and ignore the audience as a part of that creative project. I think all of that publishing, broadcasting, the stuff that we were doing in London is really a way to experiment with this idea of what constitutes an audience in a discipline or a field today. I think that's a super interesting question. I had a lovely picture I didn't get to that showed showed me sitting with students in the middle of an auditorium and a presentation going on, and because we always had cameras above us, cameras on the side, and screens on each wall, the great thing is everybody's looking a different direction. Like, nobody even knows what to look at anymore. And I think it's just another sort of energizing force to ask the question of what makes a school today. How do we make it through those activities? It's absolutely the case that from the École through Vikudamas, through the Bauhaus, through Max Bill's fantastic Hochschule für Gestaltung, the idea of communication was foundational to the idea of the school. The neat thing with that project is, of course, it aligns with disciplines or fields like your own in DMA, in which communication is actually a driving force for what you think of as creativity. But we got to get it out. You got to. I mean, it's hard.
There was always somebody willing to take on whatever you or the RCA or somebody else was doing that was provocative and then build a quick tempest just to sell a few more papers. That simply doesn't happen today. And I think that this is one of the, I mean, I'm not calling for more taboo journalism.
No, understood. No, Peter, that's, yeah. Yeah.
But I do see that as part of the structural build over the next part of the 20th.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's good, and I think your university, to a degree, acknowledges that. I mean, from my experience so far, I think there's a sense that actually there's a huge disconnect between that thing that's sort of sadly called communications and the life of a campus, you know, where they need to, and there will be a fitness where there also needs to be a vision or projects or ideas that can actually be the basis for that. I mean, we can't sort of load it off and say, man, that's just bad journalism. You know, it's like the question is, well, what is it you really have here that you would want to be taking out and why? I mean, part of it is the educating of all of those infrastructures that do that into, you know, you have to give them the basis for that. And I don't know where that stands here right now. I mean, I certainly understand the lack of critics in the world, let's say in North America. You know, best I can tell, there's 3. You know, there's one here, there's one in New York still, I think, and there's someone who travels a lot. You know, who we usually saw in London more than here. You know, there is that problem more generally within the arts, I'm sure, but I want to take that on as our problem more than acknowledge it as a larger systemic thing, you know. What else, you guys? Anything? We done? Lunchtime? Excellent. Thank you, guys.